All right, so we're right on time. This is good. This is good. Last year, after our session where we looked at the risk factors and the epidemiology, we got a little bit into the neuroscience and the physiological effect of these risk factors on the human body. We looked at a measurement tool by OCAL, and then we also looked at the CSA standard on psychological health and safety workplace and how it applies from an MSI perspective. The group got together and said, well, our next steps quite broad. What can we do? So we all talked about a person that we've known for a while and someone who carries a lot of respect and knowledge. We thought, oh, a gender lens. So this is our next presenter that we're going to start off with. All right. The title is Bent Out of Shape, Physical and Cognitive Workloads and Their Consequences Through a Gender Lens, although broadly speaking, actions for MSIs and such. So I'd like to introduce to you Karen Messer. She is a professor emerita of ergonomics in the Department of Biological Sciences of the Université de Québec à Montréal. Most of her research arises from partnerships between her university and unions and community groups, and it deals with applications of gender-sensitive analysis in occupational health, constraints and demands of work in the healthcare and service sectors, especially prolonged static standing and how the workplace conditions affect work-family interactions. In 2014, she published Pain and Prejudice, What Science Can Learn About Work from People Who Do It, describing the consequences for workers of social class bias among health scientists. The book was shortlisted among the best general books on science and society by the Canadian Science Writers Association. She has also published recently Bent Out of Shape, Shame, Solidarity, and Women's Bodies at Work, discussing the health effects of workplaces designed for a male population, which I will 100% agree from my schooling in 1992. She has received offer status in the Order of Canada for helping with pioneering research into ergonomics working conditions, particularly as they affect women's health in 2020. The Governor General of Canada's Award in Communication on the Person's Case in 2009, 2014 William P. Gant Award for the American Industrial Hygiene Association, and various other academic awards. So maybe like a silent clap. Thank you very much, Karen. I will now call up your presentation and then we can begin. We'll stop share that. And now I'll then go to your presentation. And away we go.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thanks to your wonderful staff for helping me a lot as I was preparing this presentation, and thank you for inviting me. I was a frequent visitor to the center many years ago because friends of mine told me what a pioneering job was being done at the center, and I'm so glad to know that it's still going on. So I'm going to, well, they already told you what I was going to talk about, so let's do the next slide. When you're an ergonomist, what you're supposed to think about is how do we think about work in order to improve it? You're supposed to transform it. And what we've noticed, my colleagues and I, is that when you say you're going to adapt work for all workers, you have to think about what representation of workers there is in your mind, because sometimes you're not thinking about all the workers who are there when you're trying to make the work adapted to all workers. So who's being forgotten or ignored when we think about work to transform it? People who are lower in the occupational hierarchy, and I'm going to show you some numbers a little further on about who got ignored when we were taking care of COVID in the healthcare sector. Racialized minorities are another group that are often forgotten or ignored, or worse than that, on purpose ignored. So what are the consequences of ignoring these people? And what can we do about it? That's what we're going to be talking about this morning. Andrew? And I want to tell you about the context for our work, which Andrew mentioned in his introduction, because I think everybody who has a university connection should think about doing something similar. At the university where I work, we have agreements with 3 major trade unions, and all in the same agreement. So they have to work together to decide how to do research and training that will help workers. And we also have similar agreements with women's groups and with community groups. And these agreements are extremely helpful both to professors who want to do research in these areas and to the community groups that they're serving. The professor, we get paid, well, I don't get paid right now because I'm retired, but normally professors get paid their regular salaries. The projects get approved by an official university committee, and the university actually pays for people to make these partnerships work because, for example, when I started working in these partnerships, I had no idea about occupational health. I had no idea how unions worked. I had no idea how to make my research valuable to the people who are being affected by it. So this is an important thing that has helped us get knowledge about occupational health. And in 1993, the group of unions asked our research group to work with them on women's occupational health, and we've been doing this ever since. And it's been taken over now, or the leadership of it has been taken over now by other people. So what I'm telling you is reflecting the work of a large team. So today I'm going to be talking about 3 questions. One is, why do we need to think about gender? And I'll be concentrating on gender because that's my expertise. But when we say gender, we have to think about all these other categories like social class and racialization. Why do we have to think about these during an intervention? Why is it relevant? What are the obstacles to thinking about it? And what can we do about that? Next. So here's a long slide, which is, I have a book that summarizes a lot of this information, and I'm going to be showing you a link to it later. But there's a lot of differences, biological differences between women and men, some of which have been explored, some of which haven't, some of which are big and important, some of which don't matter at all. And but there's certainly women and men have different body proportions on average. The hip to waist ratio is different, size, top of head to waist relative to height is different, and so forth. We have different muscle mass and muscle fiber type. This isn't only a biological difference. Guys do more of this bodybuilding stuff than women do in general, not always. There are differences associated with the reproductive functions, such as menstrual cycle disorders, pregnancy, nursing, menopause. For example, people don't think about this, and there's been very little research on it. But if you work in a very cold atmosphere, this can greatly, it says aggregate, but what I mean is it makes it worse, aggravate. There are different responses to fatigue. There's different proprioception is if I'm reaching out and I'm a man, I can have a more accurate perception on average of where my hand is. Women tend to think of themselves as smaller. Is this a biological difference? Is this a social difference? I don't know, but it's a difference. There are different types of body fat, different distribution. Women, if you haven't noticed, have breasts and hips and butts that look a little bit different. There's a whole bunch of research going on now about pain processing in mice, male mice and female mice. So all I'm saying is that we need to include women in our thinking and not just think that if we've done something with men, that will apply to women. Next. And an example of this is if you look at, say, the differences in hip breadth or elbow height, you can see this kind of graph may not be familiar to you, but what the graphs are saying is that when women are standing, the height of their elbow off the ground is going to be somewhat different from men's. It's going to be skewed toward lower height. No surprises there. Whereas hip breadth is going to be skewed toward a higher, a bigger number, because our hip breadth is proportionately bigger. And if you just show me the bottom of this now, Andrew, we can show you what the implications of this is. So next is that when we were talking to communications technicians, one of the big complaints they had was that tool belts, which have heavy tools on them, dug into their hips because they were made for men whose hips don't go out so far, and therefore the belts didn't dig into them. So that's an example of when you design something with a male population in mind, then you end up perhaps hurting women. Next. So another thing that happens if you forget about women is what happened to NASA. I don't know if you remember, in March 2019, NASA made a big noise about how they were going to have an all-female astronaut flight into space. And then they had to say, whoops, so we forgot we didn't have enough spacesuits for women, so we'll have just one woman on this flight. And that was a little bit embarrassing because usually when you say rocket science, you mean somebody's intelligent, not stupid. But there's, as I was saying, there's dangers if you forget women in design for all kinds of jobs. And the job I think of is hotel cleaner, where we looked it up. And the reason why, if you ever stay in a hotel and you see a cleaner pushing around one of those carts, you'll notice that they're having a really hard time because the bar of the cart is too high. And the reason the bar of the cart is too high is that in the specs for making that cart, it says the bar should be the height of 70% of the shoulder height of the average European man. And I will give a prize to anybody who can find a European man pushing one of those hotel carts. And similarly, during COVID, we had, I'm sure you've heard that there's been a lot of fuss about the fact that the masks were badly designed, not only for women, but for anybody who wasn't a European male, and for a lot of European males as well. But one thing that got less play was that a pulse oximeter is used to check for the effects of COVID, and it's reading the amount of oxygen in your blood through your skin. And guess what? They hadn't tested those oximeters on people with darker skin, and they were found to be much less accurate for people with darker skin, which is a risk to the lives of racialized populations. Next. So I've talked about biological differences. I'm now going to talk about gender differences that affect occupational health. Gender, as distinct from sex, is a social or identity term. And the fact that comes from the fact that socially women are assigned certain roles and find themselves in certain situations. The most important one for occupational health, and I'm sure you've observed it without necessarily naming it like this, is horizontal and vertical job segregation. Horizontal segregation means that women don't work in the same areas as men. Women tend to be concentrated in the service sector, care work, and so forth. The vertical segregation is the fact that women are promoted a lot less. We get lower pay. We sometimes feel a lack of respect. There's the possibility of gender harassment, sexual harassment, so that there's an up-down segregation as well as across job segregation. As well, women's social situation, and this is lessening, of course, but still women have certain roles ascribed to them in the division of labor at home, tend to do more of the domestic work. And of course, there's a risk of conjugal violence, which falls disproportionately on women. Oh, and I did mention that was where, just go back one sec. This is the cover of my book because I have to tell you about my book. And in chapters 4 and 5, I summarize the social differences and the biological differences. So if you want to see more about it, you could come across my book, which I'm sure they're going to have in their library. Thank you. women and men have different jobs, and the statistic I wanted to give you is that for women and men in Canada, this is a Canadian number, for women and men to be equally distributed across all job titles, more than half of all workers would have to change jobs. So it's a pretty profound horizontal segregation of jobs. Thanks. So here's the top 5 women's jobs in Canada in 1916. And we can see that there's only one job that's common to the list of both women's jobs and men's jobs, and that's retail sales clerk. But even within that job, women and men don't generally sell the same things. So if you have car sales, might be more often a man. If you have cosmetics being sold, it's maybe more often a woman, and so forth. So I'm going to give you more detail about the profound nature of the job segregation in a minute. Next. Thank you. And this is the vertical segregation, showing that women, for each category of racialization, women are in a higher proportion of those earning less than $15 an hour. So there is a racialization gradient where people earn less if they are less likely to be found in the population earning less than $15 an hour if they are white or Asian than if they are Black or Hispanic. But within those groups, women are always paid less. Next. This is a subcategorization of how the job segregation works, because even within the same job title, in the same place, at the same time, you find men and women being distributed differently across the tiny aspect of profession. So this is a description of a poultry slaughterhouse or poultry processing line, sorry, where the pink are where we find women and the blue are where we find men. And the thing that's important, if you can just push that thing again, Andrew, is that women are in the middle, so that women are being pushed on a very, very fast moving assembly line that gives you lots of repetitive strain injuries. And I think the rate is one industrial accident per year per person on these processing lines at the time that this study was done. So it was really a huge rate of what were mostly repetitive strain injury cases. And the women are getting pushed from behind by the men who produce what they are processing, and then pulled from in front by the people who are the men who are going on to handle the processed pieces. So the women get the animals, and then they have to cut them up really, really fast in order to get them onto the packaging and freezing and shipping. Next. And this adds up to the fact that within these jobs, the women and men have different exposures. So here is a diagram of postures of women and men cleaners in the same hospital assigned to exactly the same rooms in this particular case. And the women were much less often in neutral postures, much more often in flexed postures, and much more often in extended postures, like when you see the woman reaching up to dust over the bed, that's an extended posture. And the men and women really were working very, very differently. Next. So when you compare work activity at the same job between women and men, and you can see that the work activity is different. So we studied food servers in the same restaurant, and the women walked 38 steps per minute compared to the men walking 21 steps per minute. They walked 27% of the time compared to the men 15% of the time. Or in hospital cleaners in the same hospital with the same job title, men spent twice as much time mopping, which I don't want to belittle mopping, and mopping is important, but it's a relatively comfortable activity where you're standing in a comfortably standing position, moving around and mopping, whereas cleaning toilets, you have to bend down and you scrunch up, and not to say that it's pleasant or anything either. And women were spending twice as often cleaning toilets as the men. And when asked about it, one of the men said, well, I don't clean toilets at home. Why should I do it at work? Which is not an argument one usually hears about why one should do one's job in a certain way. And I think the explanation for the difference in the food servers' work speed, Andrew, if you give me the next flash, is you could be tempted to think it's because women have shorter steps, and of course we do, but there's only a 10% difference in the length of our steps between women and men. So why would there be 3.3 times more steps per day among women than men? And we have to think about why this could be, and there's a couple of possibilities. One is that there could be differences in the gender-based strategies. For example, women earn less in tips. It's been shown that women earn tips in proportion to their breast size and whether they have blonde hair. I'm not kidding you here, this is an actual study. And on average, earn less tips than men. So maybe they're running around trying to serve more clients because they have to serve more clients for the same money. There's another possibility, which I'm pretty sure I put on the next slide. Yeah, is that, well, there is the fact that women were assigned more housekeeping duties in addition to the food serving. So they had to clean off the tables more, they had to fill up the salt shakers more. But also, in many fast food places, particularly, and this was a fast food place, they want to have as much room taken up by tables as possible. So there's no more trays that you need to put down on a tray stand because there's no more room for a tray stand. So you're carrying all of these dishes on your arms. And men have bigger arms, so they can carry more dishes at a time. So they don't have to go back and forth to the kitchen so often. So there's all these factors that mean that if you're an ergonomist and you're studying the work activity of workers and you study women and men, it's different, and you have to think about that, and you have to think, what can I do to help both women and men stay away from RSI. Thank you. So what's the consequence of all this? Well, there are health problems, as I'm sure you know at least as much about this as I do. But I do want to point out that I'm talking about women's injuries and illnesses, not because men's are not important, but because we don't usually talk about women's injuries and illnesses. But I do want to recognize the fact that men are usually put in situations, when you have a situation that looks scary and dangerous, there's a certain tendency to put a man in that job. And if you have visible, palpable toxic exposures that everybody knows about, then men get assigned to those jobs. And if you have really noisy situations, unless they're classrooms, men get assigned to those jobs. So it's not like men have it easy. But when you look at accidents, when women enter non-traditional jobs, that is jobs that haven't been designed for them, then women have 2 to 3 times more accidents. Not because they're not able to do them, but because the job is not adapted to their different ways of working or their different size and shape. In terms of non-traumatic MSDs, which is what we're talking about, I think you're calling them MSIs, but musculoskeletal disorders, women, at least in the Quebec statistics, have 1.5 times more, 50% more than men. So women's jobs are particularly prone to getting these RSI type injuries. And women have an excess of many psychological risks, such as job strain, which you've probably heard about last year, lack of recognition. And lack of recognition is a particularly important one because when you aren't recognized and you're not believed and you're not listened to, that means you have less ability to change the parameters of your job and make it safer. And we have an expression for this in ergonomics, that's called leeway, operational leeway, which means that the more operational leeway you have, the more you have an ability to work on your workplace, the less dangerous it is for you. Next. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that in both Quebec and in France, where it's been looked at, women's health problems related to work are increasing at a faster rate than men's. And there was a higher risk of COVID. I'm going to show you details on this in a minute, but for healthcare and service workers who are mostly women, and even more for racialized women healthcare workers. Next. So here's the detail on this. And I first want you to notice the social class gradient that we have here. Now what this is a study that's just come out in Quebec of who was infected and who was not infected among people working in the same healthcare institutions in the same province at the same time. So, and the adjusted odds ratios are given on in the right-hand column for each of these groups of people. And the adjusted odds just means that how likely is it that you're going to get COVID compared to all these other people that are working in the healthcare industry. Once we've controlled for all the other things that describe you. So physicians are less likely, because the odds are less than 1 of being infected, if we control for the fact, we adjust for the fact that they may or may not be immigrant, they may or may not be Black, which are important factors as well. So if you look at the first 5 lines of this, you see a nice smooth increase from odds of 90% to 30% increased risk, 80% increased risk, 130% increased risk, or 240% increased risk as you go down the occupational hierarchy, okay? So when you go from physicians to nurses to personal support workers to nurses' aides to cleaners, as you go down in occupational class, you go up in the average of getting infected. What does this show? It shows somebody's caring more about people with more prestige, I guess. And then I draw your attention to the fact that immigrants and Black healthcare workers had, again, quite an increase in their risk of getting COVID. What's the bearing on this for RSI? Just the fact that it's a very clear way that you can see that priority is given to the health of certain people and not other people, and that we should be aware of this and try and straighten it out. Next. What are the obstacles to doing this? Now that I've convinced everybody that we really have to do something for these underserved populations, what are the obstacles to doing it? Well, the first one is all my gang of scientists are not doing our jobs. And this has been shown in a number of articles, papers, starting in 1994, when the National Cancer Institute in the United States staged a conference, which we went to. And they presented their analysis of all the scientific literature and showed that there was very little data on women and on racialized populations that was even being analyzed in occupational health. And the study has been repeated over the years, and it's still the case. It's less the case. Things are going better, particularly in Canada, where we have an Institute for Gender and Health that tries to remedy these things, but it's still a major problem in occupational health. Women are excluded from studies. Data on women are excluded from analyses. And women's biology is neglected. I've just got lots of papers showing that if you do look at toxic reactions, because of the fact we have more fat in our bodies, and different hormones, there are differences in metabolizing toxins, but everybody's still working on male mice. Women's biology is sometimes looked down on, so that when women complain that their ladders are too big for them in a non-traditional job of communications technician, they're told that if they can't do the job, they shouldn't be there. won't even get into how office temperatures are regulated. Women are generally comfortable about 3 degrees Celsius warmer than men, and all those fights about office temperatures. Women's biology is considered yucky. I know this because we started doing research on menstrual cycle disorders, and there was just a lot of pressure from feminists saying, don't start this because it'll just make them think we're awful and yucky, but also pressure from other scientists, from male scientists, saying this is not interesting, or we can figure out what happens with breast size by looking at men with fat tummies. I'm serious, this was said to me. So we are missing a lot of information that would be necessary to protect women's health. Next. Even when we have information on gender, and we've trained ergonomic students at the University of Quebec in gender, but when we studied whether they applied this knowledge, they didn't apply it. And they partly because they didn't know how to apply it. But I have to say that even my team, which is, nobody could be more conscious of gender than us because we've been working on it. Yet we go into the workplace and we immediately forget about gender. We start looking at things that hit our eyes more easily, which are obvious dangers, repetitive movements, but we don't look at gender. And part of it is that we were taught to concentrate on specific things, but part of it is also that there's a lot of resistance in workplaces to thinking about gender or racialization, because these are divisive concepts. Next. And as an example of this is a study that was done in France. France has an agency that is similar to, I guess, to the various compensation and prevention agencies in Canadian provinces, but it's a national agency that's got the job of looking after working conditions. And they were called in by a printing house that was saying, we're not going to hire women anymore because all they do is get sick. So they sent in an ergonomist to look at the work and to look at the company records. And what he found, next, was that women had more pain at almost all body sites, from the hands and wrists on the left to the elbows on the right. And so these are different body parts, and you can just see that the pink for women is a much bigger number of pain sites than the blue for men. Next. Why was this? Well, there was a very clear gender segregation of jobs. Women were almost all in jobs requiring them to handle big bunches of pages at a time, with putting a lot of pressure on their wrists. And the number of books per hour had increased over the previous 10 years by 5 times, while the number of women workers in those jobs had only increased by 50%. And no one had noticed. And in the jobs where the men were, they were more often using machines and not exposed to the increased workload. The other reason that women had more pain at all those sites was that when men had pain, they got promoted quickly out of the jobs, but there were no jobs that the women could be promoted into because they didn't ever put women into the supervisory jobs or the jobs where they were monitoring machines. Next. So when the ergonomist presented his analysis to the management, they had somewhat of an effect on the management, in the sense that the management hired more women workers, and so the workload was made somewhat easier. And the women, when they were given the results of the report, they actually cried because they were finally being recognized, and it was finally not blaming them for having all this pain. But there was no difference done in the gender segregation of the jobs, and the women were still not promoted. And the reason for that, there's a whole, Florence Chappelle, who was in charge of all this, has done a lot of thinking about it and thinking about what to do about it. But she summarized it saying these companies find it hard to treat these questions of gender inequality directly. they were just afraid that the men would complain if they put women in those jobs. They didn't really feel it was a serious problem because it was just a bunch of women having aches and pains. And that kind of inertia is the kind of thing that we've had to deal with, and I'm sure you've had to deal with in dealing with employers. I can remember meeting with a bunch of our ergonomists from the Quebec Public Health Service, and them saying, we tell the managers all the time about all these ergonomic problems, and they don't want to do anything about them. And we don't have real teeth that we can use to make them change. And that kind of inertia is a major problem, which I'm sure everybody that is listening to me right now has to deal with all the time. Next. So what can we do about it? I'm going to give you two examples. One is a macro example and one is a micro example. The next one is a local solution that we found. Actually, one of our graduate students found, Julie Corville, many years ago, where a woman and a man were working on the same machine. This is a non-traditional job where there were 3 women and 1,200 men. And the woman had grip strength much less. You can see it in the bottom. She could exert a 27 kilogram force on a particular test of grip strength, and the man was more than twice as strong as she was. And their major job was tightening bolts. You can see them tightening bolts on the same machine in the picture. And but when she used the same length wrench, which was the only one available, she was 40% slower than he was, and she was also having a tremendously difficult time with shoulder problems, because as you can see, the angle that she was working at was very different from the angle that the man was working at. So she had shoulder problems and a performance problem. And the ergonomist, Julie, went in and said, well, gee, you could get her a wrench that was longer, and then you have more of a mechanical advantage. And she got a wrench that was longer, and then she got faster than him, and she stopped having to push so hard, and she stopped having her shoulder hurt so much. So it's not rocket science, but somebody has to go in and say it has to be done. Next. We also got into a rather more complicated situation with personal support workers. We did a study of them. And when we were doing occupational health and safety sessions in the context of the University Union Agreement, both the women and the men in my sessions were saying to me, it's been a terrible idea to merge men and women in these personal support worker jobs. We used to be separate. The men used to be called orderlies. We used to be called nurses, auxiliary nurses or something like that. And now that we've merged it, it's not fair to the men, because the men are having to do much more heavy lifting than the women, because they aren't being paid anymore specifically for lifting, and we're being asked to share the lifting tasks. So the union asked us to study this problem, and we went in thinking we could study the sex difference or gender difference in lifting behavior in the hospitals. Hospital managements didn't want us to do that. They said, don't, let sleeping dogs lie. We don't want to talk about gender, but if you want to study ergonomics, that's okay. And for them, ergonomics didn't include gender, so we went right in and started studying. And the next slide. And we got a real surprise. I was really very surprised. We found that the women were doing more physically demanding operations per hour. What's a physically demanding operation? We got a list from the workers of what were the operations that they considered to be physically demanding, and a rating of how demanding they were from both males and females. We combined male and female judgment, and then we did some calculations of what they were doing. And if we considered physically demanding operations per hour, women were doing 50% more almost. So we were flabbergasted, and we couldn't figure out why everybody thought that the women were doing less. So next. We sat down with the men, and we started talking with both the men and women together, which may have been an error actually. And the men were saying, you've made this up. And we said, no, we didn't. And then when we tried to figure out why they thought we made this up, we realized that over the 200 hours, or no, it's 100 and something, 110 hours of observations, we had actually seen 3 examples of when men were specifically called on to do some operations involving physical demands or danger. And one was when there was a psychotic patient who went kind of berserk, and everybody's going, go Roger, go get him. And another was an obese patient falling out from a chair. And again, the 2 women came running into where I was watching Jean-Philippe do something, and they said, Jean-Philippe, you have to come, somebody so-and-so's falling out of her chair, you have to pick her up. And Jean-Philippe very intelligently said, well, we'll do it, all 3 of us together, which they did. But there was definitely a tendency for some people to call specifically on men to do the most obviously dangerous jobs. So that's why everybody was saying men were being prejudiced against, or men were being unfairly treated because women and men were doing the same job. But the fact was that women were still doing more of these physically demanding tasks. And why was that? Well, if you talk to the women, it's because they were afraid of overworking the men. And also because the nurses called on women to help them 4 times as often as they called on men, because they also were afraid of overworking the men. So there's all this gender politics going on in workplaces on a daily basis that we have to think about how to deal with it. Okay. And therefore, what our researchers proposed as solutions was to stop thinking about individual terms, stop thinking about performance and staffing and as individual things, and start thinking about teamwork. So what the solution, I forget if it's on this slide or the next one. Can you give me another? Yeah, thank you. Whoops, no, it wasn't. But anyway, what the solution was that we found was to tell the workplaces to assign teams to groups. So assign teams composed of many workers or several workers to groups composed of several patients, and let them work it out how everybody's going to divide up the work in some kind of fair way. And this worked out really quite well in this one long-term healthcare facility that tried it out. So we're still going on studying the importance of teamwork. So that's what we're studying right now. Next. So what can we do in our daily work lives to make work fairer at the same time as we make it safer? And really making it safer is part of making it fairer, and making it fairer is part of making it safer, is to be aware of these inequities at work. It's very uncomfortable. I hate it myself. My mind shies away from it when I try to do it, because it's challenges with parts of me that I don't want to think about. But we have to do it. And we have to think of work as a collective production, because that's what it is. And I have to say that we are now thinking about critiquing all these management indicators of workload and productivity that I'm sure they're using in healthcare and in a lot of other places in Manitoba, just as we found them in Ontario and in Quebec. These automated job prescriptors that tell people that you have to do this now and that then. And if they ever tell you to work with somebody else, they tell you who to work with and when to work with them. And it's crazy to do that without letting teams self-regulate themselves and learn how to work and live together. Finally, I understand that there are some government people in the room, and therefore you can do your job by directly combating discrimination. And to some degree, government agencies do that, and to some degree they don't. So maybe they should think about it more often. And what we've personally as professors of occupational health learned to do is work with policy analysts and people in our legal sciences department to change laws. And I could go on and on about what we did around the new Quebec law in health and safety. But it's been really, really important that ergonomists and healthcare practitioners and public health practitioners work with policy specialists so we can think about how to change laws to protect people. Thank you. And I ask here for questions, but comments and criticisms are also welcome.
Unmute myself and great. Okay. So thank you, Karen. Thank you. I was just thinking that, you know, from a psychosocial perspective, it's not so complicated, but there's many layers. And you said earlier, let's just start with the awareness, right? And we did a little bit of that last year. So I'm really glad that this is recorded. And so it'll be up on our YouTube channel shortly, so we can slow it down and make notes about all the great points that you've made. And specifically as ergonomists, I like the idea of we're not doing a gender sex study, we're doing an ergonomic study, which is a nice way of getting around that obstacle, which take that a next step further. If anybody has any challenges of, oh, I don't want to open up that can of worms about back injuries and hand injuries. We don't really need to do an ergonomic study right now. You can flip that and say, oh, we're going to do a continuous improvement project. But basically, it's the same thing. So that's a good little point I had there too. Okay, so our chat moderators have been looking over the chat. So if you have a question, so that not all 150 of us are all shouting at the same time, put in your questions in the chat, and I'll turn that off over to the moderator and we can begin. Jeffrey, Tiffany, have there been any questions?
No questions yet. Really
Actually, there is one about where the data were collected.
Oh, yes, you're right.
So I can answer that. Which is that most of, well, the study identifies it as being from France. It's from France. We did a study in Ontario. We have not studied Manitoba. Most of the data were collected in Quebec because that's where we have the university union agreement. And if you want to do a university union agreement in Manitoba, you can collect data too.
All I'm seeing here is excellent. Thank you. And I'm sure that, yes, we'll have a version of this available for a PDF for those that, but I'll tell you this, as a teacher, the best learning is to slow the recording down, pause it, make your notes, just make your notes, and then go buy your book, put in a plug there. And you haven't read a book, I was taught this a long time ago, you haven't read a book until you put little notes in the margins. So at each one of you, go buy the book and and the previous book. There, I have to do that too. So is there any, I mean, from a health and safety management perspective, the professionals out there, the safety committee members, any, besides what I said, let's get the awareness that there are these differences so that when you're out there doing an inspection or you're out there doing an investigation of an incident, I mean, there's such technical information that we can provide to you from the Occupational Health Center, but just the awareness of it would be a big asset. Anything, the next step after that, Karen, beyond the awareness?
Well, I think you want to change things.
Yeah.
One of the obstacles that we came up with when we were, and repeatedly in dealing with women entering non-traditional jobs, because right now, for example, there's a big push to, in Quebec, there's only 2% of women in construction jobs. And about 4 or 5 years ago, the construction government monitoring agency said, oh gee, you know, in Alberta it's 8%, in Quebec it's only 2%. oh, we should really do something about this. And they decided to do something about it really right away. And they put a whole bunch of brains on it. And they did a bunch of studies about work, family, and construction and so forth. And 5 years later, it's 2.3% instead of 2.1%. So there's a lot of opposition. There's a lot of inertia. These are very slow changes to get done. And so I haven't got a very quick answer for how to get these things done.
So Karen, we have.
So somebody's
go ahead,
asking,
Jeffrey.
Yeah, I just I wanted to stay ahead of the comments here. As far as the research, they wanted to know exactly what year was this, or is it an ongoing study?
This is not
data.
a single study. It's a ongoing research effort.
Mhm.
There was the formal agreement between the unions and the and our research team ended in 2010, but the research itself has been going on since then, and we've still got projects going on now. So there are specific articles that I refer to during the presentation, and they have different dates on them. But if what you really want to know is the stuff about are people still, is there still prejudice against women? Are women in non-traditional jobs still having a hard time? Is it still difficult to do research on menstrual cycle cramps and working conditions? I can assure you that it's still going on. Sorry.
And so Karen, to follow up on that, Isabella in the chat was curious whether when it comes to accommodation, menopausal period related pain was being taken into account when it comes to accommodation or reassigning work or anything of that nature?
Well, there's been very, very little research done on this. I keep checking because we published a paper, our group published the first paper on this in 1970 something, and then a bunch of papers in the 1990s. And since then, I haven't worked in it, but it's established that there's, for example, a relationship between poultry processing in the cold and having terrible cramps is well established. So what do you do about this? Well, I prefer prevention to anything else. So, and it was pointed out in the poultry slaughterhouses that the chickens actually only spend, I think it's 2 minutes exposed to the ambient temperature. So it's not really that important that everybody freeze to death in these poultry processing plants. This is not my own research, so I can't speak to it, but I would think of prevention before I would think of leave. But one thing we could think about, and one thing I keep suggesting we think about, is occupational health and safety, prevention and compensation have not taken into account female-specific problems like menstrual cycle effects. So that, for example, occupational health and safety compensation for 3 days a month off, it isn't provided for, at least in Quebec, and I haven't heard that it's provided for anywhere. In some countries, there is a law that says that women can have 3 days a month off for unpaid leave or if they have problems around menstruation. These are mostly third world countries that I've heard about this happening in. Same thing about menopausal illnesses or symptoms. So this is an area that I think policy people should be working on, because I'm terrible about it. All my legal friends yell at me if I try to talk about policy, because one has to think about all the little things that can go wrong when one thinks about policy. So I guess my advice is talk to your legal friends.
All right. Anything else, Jeffrey?
Just a comment here from Lisa to remind us that not all folks fit into the binary system of gender, and that there's a spectrum. And I know that opens up other perhaps challenges when it comes to issues around identity and such in the workplace. But I have a follow-up to that, and I hope I didn't miss it, Karen. But when it comes to actual incidents of work-related stress or outright illness that's diagnosed or otherwise, I mean, the gender lens is certainly a big part of the social and psychosocial element, which I'm really glad we're talking about today. But what about I mean, all the ergonomics are important, but what about kind of that other effect on the mind when it comes to gender? Does the research talk more about that?
I'm a biologist, so I'm ignorant of most of that. I can read epidemiological studies like everybody else, but I don't have special knowledge about psychosocial stress. I do understand that the psychosocial and the physical stressors combine to give these musculoskeletal disorders, but my expertise is not in the psychological or cognitive problems. And as far as gender is concerned, and I think this goes with some of the comments, there's certainly a wide range of gender identities, gender related behaviors, and personally, I'm not happy about making gender a binary value. Sex is another thing because it tends to be binary. I can't help that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. In my course, I tried to do a little experiment where I tried to combine the anthropometric data on various aspects of the human experience, and it didn't really work. So as Karen had said, an example, it's not just you shrink people or expand them. Different limb lengths. If you're average height, you don't have an average arm length. And then as Karen said, with the hip size. So I think we kind of discerned, and then we had some. I've had a number of my students openly are in transition and identify, and so yeah, that was an interesting topic, right? Trying to separate, well, hip breadth, as you said, versus as we're all learning over the past number of years, the psychosocial aspect of that, super important in someone's perception of the work and how the work sociologically is occurring. So I'm sure we can talk about this in another hour or two, right? So I guess we're coming a little bit up to the next our break time. Any final? Well, I guess Karen, you've had your final message. Anything else? Anybody? Tiffany or Gail from our committee? Any questions from the two of you for Karen before we go to our break?
Thank you, Professor Messing, for such a great presentation. We all appreciate it. We're so happy to see you here. Yeah, I have no question for you, but yeah,
Okay.
glad to see you here.
Yes.